The Department of Education handled about $229 billion of the $9.7 trillion that Congress allocated for federal agencies in 2024. That comes to about 2.4%. Despite the department's small size, it's taken on an outsized role in political rhetoric.
We will ultimately eliminate the federal Department of Education and send education back to Wisconsin and back to the states.
We're seeing sort of broader attacks on public education, and an extension of that is that we see attacks on the most visible symbol of public education, which is the U.S. Department of Education.
Where someone lands on this issue may come down to whether they believe regulation from the federal government is onerous on state governments, or if federal regulation serves as oversight that provides protection to children.
The Department of Education has often been described as a gargantuan bank with a third-rate policy shop attached, because the biggest chunk of the money they manage there is over $1 trillion in federal student loans. I don't know that folks who work for the Washington, D.C. Department of Education are necessarily the folks best equipped to oversee and manage a portfolio of that size.
What I'm concerned about is how these billionaires who want tax cuts are going to take funding away from kids with special needs and kids who are poor and kids who are going to college for the first time. So when you take a sledgehammer to these kind of programs that the federal government pays for, but most of them are actually implemented in states and localities all throughout America, that's a problem.
These are programs that...
Yeah, so as Trump and his administration look into ways of basically cutting costs, this same system happens in businesses as well. They kind of referenced the Department of Education as sort of a bad business. And when you go through those attempts, basically, it's easy to look at things like research and development as a cost center, or basically something that just drains your money for whatever reason. And it's hard to figure out what is actually draining your money sometimes versus what is a necessity. So an example is employees. You or I, we work for somebody, they pay us a salary or some type of paycheck in some form or another. They can look at an employee and it's easy to see, okay, employee name, salary, that's how much they cost, and just think, okay, this person does not deliver any value. They just cost me money, because on a spreadsheet, there's no real way of necessarily putting that person's direct value in towards the business. And so this is a problem that happens when you look at things purely financially, like in a spreadsheet, is that for any factor that is hard to figure out, then it's easy to just assume zero value and see all of the cost associated with it. And so again, employees, that sometimes happens, sometimes for research and development. So for some businesses, you want to continually do research because there is competition. So if you don't keep improving your product, your competitors will, because your competitors are looking to take whatever earnings you have and keep it for themselves. And so research and development is one of the ways that they develop their products to make them improved and then hopefully outpace other usage of that product from their competitors and get more of that customer market share. And so you could see it as a cost center, as a way of just losing money, because you might do some research and then it might not necessarily bubble up into anything. Or you could even be doing a certain amount of research and it's keeping you competitive. But it's hard to know how much you're investing and how effective your research is and development compared to somebody else. And so going back to the Department of Education, I'm sure this is similar, where this is a public good. And so the only real way to measure, is this successful or worth the investment, would be to figure out how much does like our GDP grow, for instance, based off of the education level of our citizens. And presumably, I would expect if you have a large population and you're generally giving out education as readily as possible, those people will become more educated. They'll be able to take on more and interesting jobs that potentially develop new and cooler things. And then that generates more revenue for the government. And then they pay through their taxes for that purpose, and then it kind of keeps cycling through. And so some of these things are hard because you're going to invest in a person who's a child potentially at this point, and you might need to wait a decade, 2 decades before you actually see whether that gave you any return on investment at all. And it's also through a variety of other mechanisms. And so it's easy to just assume that doesn't benefit you in any way. And so this is a hard thing to deal with, more broadly speaking, when you're looking to optimize your costs, is unless you get to the very final portion of like sales, for instance, like this transaction costs me this many dollars, or this much cost in marketing to get this transaction costs so many dollars, is how it works out. And so for a government, this would likely be taxes. So it's likely easy to look at any system that gains you taxes or in some way, like tariffs or income tax or real estate tax, whatever it is, and say, okay, here is where we directly get the money, and so everything else doesn't get us any money. And this happens in a variety of ways in any business or anywhere you're looking to optimize your costs.
That are put in place by laws. Congress's job is to create laws. The executive branch job is to enforce the laws. It takes a lot of political capital to get them done. And the question, I think, is, do Republicans actually want to spend the political capital on the education department? And as a congressional reporter, the answer to me seems like a very obvious no.
This entire debate about whether to abolish the department or not is symbolic. The real question is, what is it that we want the federal government to do?
Here's what the Department of Education does and what the future of education could look like in the U.S. The Federal Department of Education has existed in some form since 1867, initially created to gather information to help states develop effective school systems. The modern department was established as a cabinet-level agency in 1979 after Jimmy Carter ran on separating the agency from what is now the Department of Health and Human Services. Some Republicans have been calling for the department to be closed since it was first established. The calls don't seem to be slowing down. In 2024, 64% of Republicans and Republican-leaning Americans have a negative view of the Department of Education.
I'm going to close the Department of Education and move education back to the states.
The fight over the future of the Department of Education is symbolic of an ideological divide regarding how involved the federal government should be in regulating education.
The tone of the talking point has changed. Sometimes it's been about just sort of pulling the federal government out of education entirely. Sometimes it has felt like it's a bit more antagonistic toward public schools in general. And I think now we're in an era where it feels like it's more antagonistic and not just about reducing costs.
The Department of Education is offensive to anybody who's kind of a small government conservative because it creates a permanent infrastructure in Washington that's always trying to weigh in on what states and communities and colleges.
Yeah, so this is part of some of the rhetoric or potentially just the actual belief system in some of the parties. So for conservatives, I believe, at least for Trump, certainly, and some of the past conservatives like Reagan, I believe, was the one who popularized this notion of the government basically being inefficient and bloated. I think he was also the one who first used the phrase "Make America Great Again," which Trump obviously uses as his primary slogan. And the idea behind it is that basically you or I are paying so much into taxes, and the government is squandering those taxes into frivolous means. And so the divide comes from these segments, which is usually for folks of this opinion. They want as little funding to go to the government as possible and have as few responsibilities for the government as possible. So therefore, they can't waste that money theoretically. And so the money stays closer to the people, whether that's in your pocket or maybe in your state or local jurisdiction, and that can be how it's decided. Usually the opposite view, coming from more of the liberal perspective, is generally that there should be more regulation on certain things and that the government should be more and more involved in a variety of purposes. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that they are completely disjoint, because I would expect and have heard from certain conservatives that they do expect some regulation from the government. And I would expect if we take out party lines from this, if you as a person said, I wouldn't want the government to be too involved in the healthcare system, I'm perfectly fine with what's currently going on, you'd probably be like a very small percentage of the population. I would expect most people to say, no, I hate the healthcare system in America. It's outrageously overpriced. It can put you into debt. It can completely derail families. You might not get the care that you need. You might even avoid care when you need it. And the same argument could be made about our education system, which is especially for college or even some of our more public education bases where, because of certain policies and changes that have happened over time, such as like no student left behind. I'm forgetting the exact naming of that phrase, but effectively what ends up happening is that we sort of tried pushing for everybody to pass school and not achieve as much of on the high end. And so we're outpaced in scores to other countries, and I think that's a pretty regularly stated fact. Obviously, healthcare for sure, college education prices for sure. These are some of the biggest failings of our government today and our society today in America. And so this is where I would expect most people, regardless of political affiliation, would say something needs to be fixed there. Like, it should be affordable to have healthcare. It should be affordable to get an education to some extent. But there's certain things that the government does, especially that you don't agree with sometimes. And so for conservatives, this might be like reproductive rights, for instance. Maybe they don't want the federal government to be involved. And for liberals, they do want them to be involved. And so you end up in these scenarios where they're saying, well, we're paying for them to get involved in things I don't want them to be involved in. And they're not actually fixing the things that I want to be fixed. And so this is where you can look at this problem one of the two ways. One of which is, well, if they're not going to fix it, then why am I giving you this money to fix other things that I don't think are broken, or I don't want you fixing the way you're fixing it? So you pull back funding from them. And then the other perspective is you say, well, you are trying to fix some things. Maybe you haven't fixed what I want yet. I will give you more funding and want you to fix additional things. That way, eventually you fix what I want. And so I think that's what leads to this dynamic. But if you have a different opinion on this, I'm happy to hear. Please post it in the comments.
Should be doing for their part.
The U.S. Department of Education has become a symbol of public education and public schools across the country. And what we've seen in polling ever since the COVID shutdowns is Americans, and particularly Republicans, have lost a lot of trust in U.S. public schools. And there's now a big division in how Democrats feel about public schools versus how Republicans feel about public schools. And I think the department has become a symbol of that.
In reality, states and localities already have immense power when it comes to educating the students in their state and in their district. They already get to sort of set the rules on what they're teaching curriculum-wise.
I don't think we need the Department of Education. I'd be fine if it didn't exist, but I can also count to 60. And to dismantle a federal department, you need an act of Congress.
One of the Republican Party's platforms in 2024 is to rein in wasteful federal spending, but abolishing a federal agency doesn't automatically turn off the spending tap.
All the money the Department of Education has really is the money that's authorized by Congress. All of these programs will continue to exist and get money unless Congress voted to stop funding them. The debate about the future of the department is symbolic. What really matters is what we decide to do about the staffing and funding of these assorted programs.
When asked for comment, a Trump-Vance transition spokesperson wrote in part in a statement to CNBC, President Trump believes that school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. By returning education back to the states where it belongs, President Trump will improve academic excellence for all students. The Department of Education did not respond to CNBC's request for comment. One of the department's biggest responsibilities is dispersing federal student loans and managing loan forgiveness programs.
The U.S. Department of Education, in a lot of ways, it operates like a bank. If you're looking at a full portfolio of loans and all the money that flows through the department, it is quite large. If you're looking in terms of what is the size of the department staff, it's about 4,400 employees. It's small relative to other agencies in the federal government. So it has kind of a small staffing footprint.
More than $114 billion of the $229 billion that passes through the department goes toward the federal
Yeah, so this is where they're highlighting where student loans come in. And this is where, depending on your perspective, some people have highlighted that the student loan and the federal student loan programs are a key reason as to why education for like college has gotten so expensive. Because once the government basically made it so easy for people, young people who are like 18 years old, to get a lot of money all of a sudden and then hand it over to another entity, then that entity basically sees, in this case, colleges, that, hey, these kids are coming up with hundreds of thousands of dollars from the government, and effectively the schools are using students and young people basically to pull a bunch of money from the government. They're saying the government's allowing them to have all this money. We may as well take it from them. What else are they going to do with it? The government made it specifically for this purpose. So let's try to get as much of that as humanly possible. And so they'll keep increasing that price to basically absorb as much of the federal loans as possible, is basically the negative way of looking at this. And to some extent, we did see price balloon around the time that the federal government started increasing the loan availability for students. And so this is certainly something that is debatable on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your personal perspective.
Direct student loan program, according to usaspending.gov. The department is also responsible for issuing Pell Grants, which are usually granted to undergraduate students on a needs basis and typically do not have to be repaid. It also manages Title I funds, a federal aid program for K-12 schools serving low-income students. In the fiscal year 2024, Congress allocated $18.4 billion to the program.
It is a program that provides funds particularly to students who live in concentrated poverty. And part of the reason for that is that if we were to have education systems that relied purely on local and state funding, you would see these kind of vast inequalities in how much funding is available to schools. And so the federal government plays this role of kind of offsetting that.
The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a federal law that ensures services to children with disabilities and provides funding to states for additional services. Congress funded IDEA to the tune of $15.4 billion in 2024. But the department's job goes beyond managing money.
The Department of Education, not the Department of Justice, is the one who deal with ensuring that kids have equal access to schools.
The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, is responsible for ensuring that students are not subjected to discrimination. It fields complaints, oversees compliance reviews, and works with schools to develop and implement corrective actions to bring them into compliance. The OCR was given $140 million in 2024 by Congress. But ultimately, it's the White House that gets to decide what the OCR prioritizes.
When somebody says we're going to strip it all away and just give it to the states, then how do you protect poor kids? The implementers, the ones who actually get that check to somebody, they become more important than the pontificators, because that's what makes it real.
Title IX is a high-profile federal law that the Department of Education is responsible for enforcing. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any education program or activity that receives federal financial assistance.
When it comes to something like the regulations that relate to Title IX, the Trump administration can do a lot.
So this is a topic that I feel like has been getting a lot of debate recently, which is DEI, generally speaking. And this is something that is getting pulled back a bit. Companies are seeing it. Trump himself is looking to basically abolish this from the federal government. And so this is something where it's hard to put into a number, and where most businesses expect, and I think this is true in other areas as well, like education, is if DEI was something that was guaranteed to give you higher returns on investment, then people would be doing it inherently. And so if there was a clear, direct one-to-one mapping of, if I have a more diverse team, I start making more profits as a business, then companies would be doing it anyway. You wouldn't even have to advocate for it. It would just be done. But that link doesn't exist. While there's been some anecdotal evidence and there's some belief that employees work better in these environments, there's no clear research or testimony saying for sure And anecdotally, you are probably not going to see it. If you hire somebody of a particular class or race or gender, whatever it is, versus somebody else, you're not even going to know. You're not going to know whether or not that person was better or not, or whether you're more profitable or not. And also, they're likely a drop in a bucket. You probably have a bunch of employees, and so a single employee is likely not going to shift the dynamic massively. And in some cases, they even have discussed where, to avoid sort of like this tokenization of this individual, you likely need a grouping of them for them to be able to fully succeed as themselves as an individual. And so this is where likely in a single one-off case, you're probably not going to see any major difference. You likely have to invest noticeably, and that's going to be a hard thing to do for folks. I feel like this is going to be true for education as well, or any other system, which is the way that I've heard the conservative view presented quite a bit is just get the best people. Like, that is what we should be doing, period, regardless of business, education, whatever it is. Why does it matter what their background is, what they look like, what gender they are? Which I think is an inherently reasonable argument. I think the key difference here that exists is bias. And I think this is where conservatives see bias as sort of, I think even Trump himself has seen it as sort of like a anti-American sentiment where people are inherently wrong or inherently bad in some way, and that he doesn't seem to be a proponent of it. And other folks believe bias is inherent and that it's very easy to be biased against particular groups, especially groups that are not like you or the people that are around you. And so this is a situation where both of these things are sort of playing into each other, which is, on one side, you could go with the conservative argument and say the best person for the job is always the best person, whether that's being an employee or the person who's going to get the best education. That should be how it works, theoretically. But the issue comes into play is, how do you determine who is the best? And I think that's where the nuance comes in for this conversation, where there's a variety of ways to measure how good somebody is, and those things can be inherently biased. So, for instance, where you're born could be a huge aspect of it. There's varying levels of education within America, and so you could be born in a very rural area in a state that doesn't invest that much in education, and that could be a very different level of education from maybe somebody who's in an urban area across the country. And so those two individuals might have varying levels of education. One could be better, one could be worse. One doesn't necessarily have to invest more in education versus the other. Maybe there could be smaller class sizes in somewhere that is more rural versus urban. And that could allow for greater success for that individual. And these things generally compound. So, like, for instance, if you were to take somebody who was successful at 5 years old, like in their first year of schooling, give or take, and then decide where they go to school afterwards based off of that 1 year, that could be impacted by so many things. There's some study that has gone into this exact thing. I believe it was the book Outliers, if I'm not mistaken. And they discussed how in the field of hockey, effectively this exact thing occurs, where people decide who are the best hockey players at a relatively young age. I believe it was somewhere around this age of 6 years old, somewhere in the 5 to 7 range. And then they get entered into these sort of advanced hockey leagues where they get a lot of training, they spend a lot more time playing, and these are decided when people are pretty young. And so what they actually found was that there was a huge bias towards people who were a particular month of the year birth date. And this was because of the cutoff for the ages. So for the sake of this example, let's say January is the cutoff for whether you go in to the program or not. So that means if you're born in December, you are likely going to be the youngest individual who's part of that group. So somebody could be almost an entire year older than you who you're competing against, at least 11 months, let's say. And so they have 11 more months of experience from potentially playing. They have 11 more months of growth and development on their own. And so that's not necessarily fair. And what they were seeing is that actually over time, this started to skew way more to the point where, like, I believe like half of the Canadian Hockey League were basically born in a 2-3 month span. And so this is where some of these biases aren't necessarily based off of race or gender or anything. They can just be inherently part of how you're measuring your progress as an individual. And I think this is where, going back to education again, it's hard to make a statement such as the best person should be the one who keeps progressing, because there's no way of knowing truly who the best individual is on that front. Even for yourself and whatever you do for work or your career, there's usually a variety of skill sets that are incorporated. There's usually like the hard skills and the soft skills, for instance. And then there's also experience in your particular domain. So you could end up in a situation where somebody is great at the hard skills that they have, but terrible at the soft skills. And how do you compare that individual to somebody who has amazing soft skills, but terrible hard skills? And this is one of the hardest parts of managing individuals and assessing their performance, is that not everyone is exactly the same. And there's no clear-cut way to say which skill is the most valuable and a clear way of measuring that specific skill for a person.
Lot unilaterally in that space, and I think they very likely will. The Biden administration has tried to expand our understanding of sex-based discrimination to also include discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and I think it's basically a foregone conclusion that the Trump administration will revert back to the prior understanding there.
While eliminating the Department of Education has been a talking point for President-elect Trump, it would take an act of Congress to make it happen.
When you hear House Majority Leader Steve Scalise talk about the first 100 days under the Trump administration, you hear a lot of things about border security, about immigration, about energy. You don't hear a lot about eliminating the Education Department.
In Trump's first term, there was not a lot of appetite among Republicans for cutting spending for IDEA or for Title I or for Pell Grants. So if you're a low-income student or you're a family of a child with special needs, I think the idea that there's going to be substantial cuts to those programs is pretty unlikely.
I know a soundbite when I see it. The real issue is, how are you going to help kids? And if you make this a mess, you're not helping kids. They are trying to shift what was created in America by the New Deal. They want winners and losers.
Abolishing the Department of Education appears to be only one aspect of the broader reforms outlined in Project 2025, a collection of policy plans developed by conservative think tank the Heritage Foundation in collaboration with more than 100 other right-leaning organizations.
It is important to acknowledge that Project 2025, it's not clear how the Trump administration will feel about that document. And there are some indications that Trump just isn't all that interested in education in the first place. So with that caveat, that we really genuinely don't know how seriously they're going to take this.
Trump distanced himself from the document while he was campaigning, but has been taking suggestions for potential hires from the personnel database created by Project 2025 during his transition into the White House.
Project 2025 basically frames a discussion of big changes in federal education policy around the idea that American schools are underperforming. There's a kind of culture war piece to this that has a lot to do with gender and sexuality and race. And then there are some potentially big structural changes when it comes to the federal role in education.
Experts say another one of the structural changes that Project 2025 suggests could be reducing the number of requirements attached to the funding provided to disabled students through IDEA.
This is what wonks tend to call block granting, giving the money to states or school districts with more freedom to spend it. And you could do that with a lot fewer bureaucrats, but somebody would do it. And if there weren't a Department of Education, presumably they would be attached to some other federal entity, whether that was Department of Labor or Department of Health and Human Services.
The problem with that, in my view, is that those strings that are attached actually really matter, because it's the strings that are attached that help to ensure that the funds are getting to the students with disabilities and getting them the services they need and ensuring that they have the opportunities that they should have.
Project 2025 also proposes block grants for federal funds to low-income students that are allocated through Title I. Under the plan, the block grants would be available for a 10-year period, after which the federal role would be phased out entirely, leaving the states to decide whether to provide that funding to schools.
One lesson we've had from what a lot of states have done when they've had more of that kind of flexibility is that we've seen that some states just don't fund that kind of thing. And so if we actually were to eliminate Title I funding, it would be really problematic for a lot of students across the country.
Superintendents, school principals, school boards are accountable to their communities. People can see what schools are doing. People can choose to vote in school board elections. Superintendents can be replaced. When federal officials, whether in Congress or the Department of Education, are trying to write rules for schools, they're trying to write rules for 14,000 school districts that encompass about 100,000 schools in 50 states.
So again, I think this is where the difference in opinions start to play out. So what he's mostly discussing is how do you push ownership and accountability closer to the communities that are impacted by it? And at face value, I think that is not a bad idea. Like, I think that makes sense, generally speaking. If you are at your school and you know the person who's in your community, you vote for this person, you guys can decide whether or not they're doing what's in the best interest of your community. Makes a lot of sense. It gives power back to the people to some extent where they get to decide. However, again, going back to that bias aspect of, well, what happens if you're in an area where they don't like certain types of people for whatever reason? Maybe it's their race or their sexual orientation, for instance, or maybe disabilities, for instance. This is, as an example within the education system, this is something that is somewhat observed in schools that basically try to hit the top of those education lists, is that sometimes they'll teach to the test, and also they'll basically discourage disabled or more needier students from being at that school because they might drag down the scores in their mind. And so instead of helping those people do a better job, sometimes they sort of push these students out in order to raise themselves up. And so they're sort of artificially inflating the segment. And so using that as an example, that could be something of interest to you. You as a parent of an able-bodied child, you could be thinking, well, I want my kid to go to the best possible school. And so for that to happen, I want my school that my kid goes to get the highest ranking, and then therefore they'll be more appealing on the application. And also maybe they can have more time here and maybe have a lower ratio of students to teachers if we can get rid of some of these other students that I don't care as much about, like these disabled ones or ones of other backgrounds. And so that's where these things get more complicated, where you're assuming that everybody is going to be treated fairly. And I think that's where some of that federal regulation comes in, which is if you have to make a decision that benefits the entire population, you can make something that impacts every area a little bit and hopefully push things in the favor of whoever might need that help at that point in time. But again, this is where if you brush with broad strokes, you might set up a policy that makes sense in mass, but maybe for a particular pocket of the population, it's not particularly helpful to them. It may be detrimental to that particular pocket, but that's where, when you do this enough times, it should be broadly beneficial. And that's where it's hard to figure out what the difference between what is beneficial and what isn't beneficial comes into play. And again, this is where going into the accountability piece, we can use another example here of more affluent families versus less affluent families. This is where if you have control and authority over your local government, likely the people who have the most money are going to have the most control over their local government. They're going to be the ones who maybe give most of the taxes to that area. Maybe they're the ones who support the businesses around there. And so you're going to have a little bit more sway. And so again, this is where it depends on who you are and your perspective in this case. And so this is where if you are an affluent white family, you might be pro policies that give you and your family more authority and more power and more preferential treatment over other groups. And this is where those things need to be balanced, where the people who are potentially less able to impact these things are potentially even immigrants. Like, what if you had an immigrant who isn't as good at speaking English, for instance? They're maybe not necessarily going to have the best job. They might not be able to advocate for themselves or their child as well as somebody else could. And so this is where do those people and their children just get less benefits from these categories. And this is where these things are very complicated. And so even for myself, I don't know. I'm not an expert in education or how this would work at a societal level. And so this is where potentially even giving more control to the local governments could be reasonable if they're still observed and there is oversight from the federal government. Maybe that's another way to push this down and have a shift in this, is you give more autonomy to the local governments, but then the federal government audits each of the local governments to make sure that they're doing things adequately, which could be a different way of handling this problem, for instance. But there might not be a one-size-fits-all, and so this is where all these disagreements come from.
That is a huge ask of anybody, given the variability. And so what you wind up with is lots of rules that have to be exquisitely interpreted, and it winds up making life really difficult for lots of teachers and principals working in classrooms.
I think a lot of us are a bit in wait and see mode because we honestly don't know how much of this Trump is going to want to adopt and how high of a priority is, when I think a lot of us think that immigration and the tax bill are going to be much higher priorities than anything that has to do with education.
Student loans and loan forgiveness are contentious issues. President Biden made student debt relief a focus of his administration and used the Department of Education to carry out his plan.
I think they're skeptical of what the Biden administration has done, both from the perspective of, is that legal? And then also, I think there's a lot of skepticism that maybe it was too generous. I think it's very clear that we'll see a lot of those initiatives stop. Project 2025 starts to go a couple of steps further, and here it's kind of not clear exactly what will happen, but there's some language in the direction of privatizing the student loan portfolio, for example, and potentially consolidating a lot of different loan programs, which actually Trump made some moves in the direction of doing that in his first term.
The Biden Department of Education continued a temporary pandemic repayment pause for a couple of years after everybody agreed the pandemic was over. It has also continually told borrowers that they don't need to start making repayments yet. The new Secretary of Education is going to face an unprecedented challenge in that they will have to restart the machinery of repayment. They will have to deal with the frustration of borrowers who were told, and they thought in good faith, that they wouldn't have to repay their loans. They're going to have to try to collect funds that were promised to taxpayers that are not coming in.
I've heard them talk about getting rid of loan forgiveness for people in the public service. So how are we going to get people to go to the public service? How are we going to get people to become firefighters and police officers and go into the army and go into teaching if the cost of college is too much and we don't have a way to pay people more? The whole issues around affordability of college are huge. And this is another indication about people who want winners and losers instead of the promise of America for everybody.
I think a lot of us are a bit in wait and see mode because we honestly don't know how much of this Trump is going to want to adopt and how high of a priority is, when I think a lot of us think that immigration and the tax bill are going to be much higher priorities than anything that has to do with education. So there is a lot of uncertainty. And then there is also some uncertainty that comes to, we all have our understanding of what they are able to do based on our sort of current understanding of American law and norms. And there is this sort of looming caveat with everything, which is if they just violate a bunch of those norms and violate a bunch of those laws and everything goes to court and we sort of see what happens in courts, then a lot of what seems impossible now might not be so impossible if they really decide to push down that path.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.